Welcome to part 2 of my series on buying a 1986 to 1995 Mercedes-Benz. In part 1, I went over 10 reasons why you should consider owning one of these. And I want you to go back and look at that video if you haven't, because it's going to give you the background. You kind of see where I'm going to go with this series. In this part 2, I'm going to talk about 10 reasons why you shouldn't. And I know what some of you are thinking. Hey, Kent, you're a Mercedes enthusiast. You shouldn't tell people that they shouldn't own these cars. Well, just a minute. Not everyone should own a 20 to 30-year-old Mercedes-Benz. Right here, you're looking at a 1990 300 SE. This is the W126 chassis, which was built from 1980 up to 1991. And I just recently watched a video by the designer of this car. His name was Bruno Seiko. He was a famous designer for Mercedes for years. And he said that the W126 chassis was one of his crowning achievements. And you know, I talked about the design of these cars in part 1, and almost all of them can be attributed to this one man. Isn't that amazing? Boy, he was one talented designer. Now, the first reason you would not want to own one of these cars is they are old. That's right. Just because they are old. When you look at a car that's 20 years old and older, you start running into problems with it that have nothing to do with mileage. They have nothing to do with neglect. They have nothing to do with lack of maintenance. It's just they're old, and a lot of parts, particularly plastics and rubber, start to deteriorate, even if they've been parked in a garage. You might find one that's got 30,000 miles on it that hasn't driven in 10 years, you actually could have more problems with that car than if you found one like my white coupe that has 114,000 miles, been driven every year for about 5,000 miles a year. So that's number one. These cars are old. Now also, I get comments from time to time from people say, hey Kent, why don't you just buy a Toyota or a Honda? And then all your problems would be over. Well, that might be true for somebody else, but for me, my problems would just begin if that's all I could drive, okay? And I won't get into that in this video. But it does bring up the second reason why you shouldn't own one of these. If your total concern about owning a car is maintenance, not having to pay for maintenance, not having to fix anything, then do not buy one of these cars. Even when they've been well kept, they're going to need maintenance, like my white coupe that you saw in part 1. Already I know it's going to need shock absorbers. At 114,000 miles, I said, hey, this thing's not riding quite right. And you know, I'm going to do a little video to show you how to test for bad shock absorbers, but it's going to need shocks. They got neglected, okay? And there's a few other little things that need repairing on that car, so you need to be prepared for maintenance. They're not maintenance free. That doesn't mean they're bad cars, but because of the complexity of systems, take for instance the way they handle and ride. A lot of that has to do with how the suspension is designed and all the rubber parts that go into the suspension, and that wears out. So if you like the comfortable ride and the nice feel of Mercedes-Benz, when they get old, they're going to need some attention, all right? Now, number 3 is it's really hard to find a good, honest, reliable mechanic that knows these old cars. You might find one locally, you may not, but if you can, I would hang on to that person. In fact, I would recommend you use that person to help you go find one of these cars. They can help you locate a good example and then actually do a pre-purchase inspection. If you haven't had a Mercedes before and you're thinking about getting one, I'd go find out where you could get it repaired in your local area with a good independent mechanic. Now, if you can't, then you're going to have to do the work yourself. And now for number 4, it takes good, hard, diligent work to find one. I didn't just stumble across that white E320 coupe. Now, I wasn't looking for a coupe, but I was looking for a good example of a car during this period. And I was diligently looking on Craigslist and checking the ads every night, kind of lay there in bed, you know, just before I go to sleep and pull up the iPad and thumb through the Craigslist. And sure enough, one night that E320 coupe showed up, and I contacted the owner the next morning, and by 12 noon, that car was gone. So if you hadn't been checking Craigslist yourself, you wouldn't even have known that car was even available for sale. So it does take diligence. It takes some real effort to find cars in really good condition, because that's what you want to do. You don't want to go out and find an old dog, some old Benz that's been unloved and think you're going to restore it. Let me tell you, that's the last thing you want to do. And that's a big part of the reason why I'm going to do this series for you who decide you really want to go buy one. Now, number 5, depending upon where you live, it may not be easy to find one locally. This is particularly true if you live in the Midwest, Northeast, where they use a lot of salt on the roads. I've seen cars out of Chicago, and it's tough. It's not just the rust holes that need body work. It's all the rust under the car that affects every bolt, every fastener. It just makes the car very difficult to work on. So if you live in one of these areas, you may have to go outside the area to find a good example of an 86 to 95 Mercedes-Benz. And we're going to go over that later in this series. Now let's go on to number 6. The next reason you would not want to own one of these cars is, and I consider this a big one, you will have to learn to do some of the maintenance yourself. Now that's not to say you can't own one of these and have somebody else work on it all the time, but I found if that happens, a lot of time the honeymoon can get over very quickly. I just saw an ad on Craigslist last night for a 560 SEC. He bought it 3 years ago. It's a very nice car, but he said right in the ad he's selling it because he just can't afford to keep getting it fixed. And it was a very nice low mileage W126 coupe, but he obviously didn't do any of the work himself. He said something about paying some outrageous price for getting the spark plugs changed. So I'm just going to encourage you, if you want to make this a very enjoyable experience, you're going to have to consider doing some of the maintenance yourself. If you've never worked on a car before, don't let that bother you. I mean, you might find it's quite enjoyable. I've had a number of people tell me that they like working on their old Mercedes. It's kind of therapeutic. Okay, so that's obviously one person's opinion. But I'm going to say for those of you who say, well, I really want one of these cars, but I just am not going to work on it myself. Well, here's what you need to do, okay? And this would be number 7. You need to put aside a reserve account for maintenance. Now, that doesn't mean you need to put it into a bank account. What you need to do is put it right up here in your head. Because I've run into people say, oh no, I bought this old Mercedes and I got a really good deal on it. And man, I had to take it to this mechanic and I had to spend $1,200 for all this work. Well, that person obviously wasn't psychologically ready and it really bummed them out. And I think this happens quite often to people. But if you buy a nice car like this, let's say you buy a nice W126 for $4,000 or $5,000, you'll find out, things will come up now and then, and if you put aside a couple $1,000s in your mind and say, well, gee, even if I put $2,000 or $3,000 in maintenance, I've still got a $6,000 or $7,000 car. It's a pleasure to drive. People love it. I enjoy it. And it's cheaper than some of those import cars that you can buy. So it's a psychological thing. Think about putting aside a reserve for maintenance in the future if you're not going to do any work yourself. Now, number 8, these cars right here, 86 to 95, require more preventative maintenance than some other cars because of the age and the complexity of systems and how they're engineered and built. And the big one I've seen over and over again, it doesn't matter what car I've looked at, is lack of lubrication. And I know if I get into my white E320 coupe and start messing around with a sunroof, I'm going to find out that that sunroof has never been lubricated. The tracks are going to be all dried out. And if I don't lubricate it, I could have some real problems down the road with failure of components. So I'm going to set an entire episode in this series aside for just talking about lubrication. It means getting into your doors and lubricating all those parts that haven't been lubricated in 20 years, okay? So there's some preventative maintenance. And this is something I can help you with. A lot of my tech help on my website really deals with preventative maintenance. It kind of comes from my aviation background, I think. Being a pilot and an aircraft mechanic, preventative maintenance is really important, okay? Especially where I was flying. Now, number 9, and I'm not going to get into the details in this particular episode because I'm going to take just a separate episode where I can talk about some of the known issues on these particular models. And I'll have to go through each chassis, so it may take 2 or 3 parts actually if I'm going to cover it thoroughly. But there are known problems with some of these cars. And if you know about the known problem, maybe you can even use that to negotiate a better price because you know it's going to have to be fixed, or you know enough about it that you can actually ask the seller if some of those things have been done or they've been taken care of. That's a big advantage when you go to buy one of these cars. So you kind of need to know about the car that you want to buy, or you want to know about some of these known problems, and we'll cover that later in this series. Number 10, extremely important. These cars do not have cup holders. It's kind of funny. I know people have joked about this. It seems like the German cars, they were the last holdout to put cup holders in their cars. They said, hey, these cars are for driving, they're not for drinking. Okay, but that's just a joke, okay, but they don't have cup holders. When I talked about those known problems, it brings me up to the introduction to next week's episode, where I'm going to talk about doing your homework, because that's something you're going to have to do. Don't have somebody tell you, well, this is what you should buy, or get this model here because it's way better than that model. You want to go out and do some homework. You want to do some due diligence. And then when you do that, you'll actually find out about some of those known problems. You'll find out some of the strengths and weaknesses of each chassis, and you may get an idea of which one you want to own. Now, I know there's a number of you out there that are watching this video that you've got all kinds of these cars, you've owned lots of them, and you're just kind of watching this out of curiosity. So maybe this next part in this series is not particularly suited for you, but we're going to cover this. It's going to be geared for those of you who've always thought about owning one of these, but have thought, well, I don't know about that. That might be kind of expensive, or they might have some problem. I'm not sure what I should get. So that's what we're going to cover in next week's part.